Hi everyone, welcome to another tutorial session from Bhutan Tech community. Today we will be covering some important topics on JavaScript. They are callbacks, promises, and closures. First we will go through closures. Second we will see callbacks. And third we will see promises. So here you go. We will see promises, callbacks, and closures. And we also need to know what is a scope. We also need to know what is synchronous and asynchronous. So we need to know all these topics. We need to know these three things before we learn these three things. So I'll be starting with scope, then I'll move to synchronous, asynchronous, then we'll cover closures, callbacks, and promises. So let's clear everything and hit run again. By the way, I'm using jsfiddle.net, which is a playground for JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And I've also left the saved fiddles from my user account below in the comments. You can check it out. It's from the lessons in this tutorial. Let's see how we can use scopes in JavaScript. Let's say we have a variable a here, which is equal to 1. Let's console log it. Let's attach a string to it, say something like global, so that we know where this console log is coming from, which line is it coming from. We have another function which is called inner scope. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm calling it inner scope. And we have another variable a here, which is 2. And we can console log this one also. We can say this is inner, and we'll log a again here. We will have another function, but this function is a special one. You see, we cannot declare a function like this, right? It's saying missing a name, but we can get around this by simply making it an IFI. An IFI is a immediately invoked function expression. That means you are declaring and invoking it at the same time. So now that error should be gone. Okay, let's move on. Variable a is equal to 3. Console log it. Let's say this one is inner. Let's see what this one logs. It only logs global 1 because we forgot to call this function. Now if I run it, it should log inner global 1, inner 2, and inner is 3. So this took this value, this one takes this value, this one takes this value. So now I think you might have already got the idea of scopes, because this block here, this is the scope actually. This blocks. Whenever you start with the curly braces, it starts a block and it will end the scope. So the scope for this one starts here and it ends here for this function, right? Inner scope. For the global, the whole thing is a scope. So if it's in the scope, it will take that value. And let's see what happens if we delete this one. Let's play it again. Now it's saying inner is 2. So why? Because it couldn't find it in this scope where the function starts and ends. There's no a, there's no variable a here, so it didn't find it. So it moved to the next parent scope. So it found 2 here and then it rendered 2 here. So that's how scope works. But this one only works from inside out. This does not work from outside in. What I mean here is, if I say this is global, and if I try to do, okay, let's actually keep this as a only. Let's change this to inner. Let's change this one to inner. play it again. Now it's saying, say, inner is not defined. So it's complaining from this line, right? It's throwing an error from here. It's saying inner is not defined here. Why? Because this is, it does not exist in this scope. This scope, the window scope or the global scope, it does not exist in this scope. That's why it said inner is not defined. What if we make this one inner? Let's run it again. Now it says inner is 1. So now the problem is solved. So like I said, scopes do not work from outside in, it works from inside out. That means a child function can access the scope of a parent function, but a parent function cannot cannot access the scope of a child function. Now let's see what's asynchronous and synchronous. For this one we need 3 functions, I think. 3 functions, okay. So we'll call this function third. It will take number as an argument and it will return number plus 3. Okay, let's copy this one. Let's call this second. Let's take number as an argument again, but this one we'll call the third function. Let's say this one is the first function and this one we'll call the second function. Let's call the first function here and let's see what happens. Actually we need to log it so that we can see the result. Let's log it. Okay, it's none. Why? So you're adding, okay, this should be 2, that should be 1, and we cannot have a number here because this will make it none. So, and this should work, yes. So what happens here? When I say console log, first it tries to run this function, right? Then it tries to run this one. Then it tries to run this one. So let's put breakpoints everywhere and see what happens. So let's say we have debugger everywhere and let's inspect it. Now let's try to run it again. It should hit. Okay, let's try to run it again. It should hit the debugger, right? It got into the first function. It's trying to run the first function. Now it will go to the second one. Now we'll go to the third one. And you can see here the stack, right? This is the call stack. So it tried to run the first function, then the second one, then the third one. It's also giving the current scope. It's saying number is 3. It's saying this number is 3. So it's giving the scope of this one. So it's saying there's something called this and it contains the window object. So let's play it again. And that is what we call a synchronous, because it's running in sequence, right? In the order we call them. That's a synchronous. This is a synchronous flow. But let's see what's an asynchronous flow. So let's see. We have a function called setTimeout, which is available on the window object. So let's say setTimeout, we need to pass a function to it. So let's pass a function to it and we can say console.log set timeout ran, right? And what this function actually does is it actually delays this function by 1 second. So this is in milliseconds. So 1 second is 1000 milliseconds. So this is in milliseconds. You have to give the timer value in milliseconds, and it will delay this function, delay the function by 1 second. So let's see what happens with this one. We actually need those debuggers. Let's see when this function runs. So you can see it's trying to run the first function. Okay, it didn't work because I made a typo here. It should be set timeout. Now it should work. It's trying to run the first function, it's trying to run the second function, now it's trying to run the third one. So you see first, second, third, but it didn't go into the set timeout one. So why did that happen? Because you can see here it's an asynchronous function, right? So usually events and HTTP requests, DOM events and network request, these things go to the something called the event queue, and they become asynchronous functions. So whenever the synchronous function stack is clear, it tries to run the asynchronous functions. So you can check this one out in much more depth, but this is what asynchronous and synchronous means. So asynchronous is handled quite differently in JavaScript. So this is even showing you here. It's saying this is a async function. So if we go back to our console and see what is logged, so you see it, even though like we called it here, it's logging it later, right? Because this stack was busy, because when we tried to call first, it was evaluating this one, right? It tried to go till the third function, and the stack was busy, the synchronous stack was busy, and it only became free when the third function evaluated. So now, like after it evaluated to 6, then the stack became free. So now the set timeout function finally logged to the console. So that's why we have our 6 first and set timeout ran second. So this is synchronous and asynchronous, but there are a lot of asynchronous functions we can find in the JavaScript web API, so you can check them out too. So that's all for synchronous and asynchronous. Now let's move on to another topic. Let's clear this one. Let's look at the 3 topics: closure, callback, and promises. So let's do a function here again, which is called add to, and we have a variable called a here, which is 2, and we will pass an argument to it, which is b, and we will return another function, return another function. We will console log a. So a is, how much is a plus b. B is, let's keep a space here, and b is b, right? And we do this one and total. So we do this one, and the total is, we have to add a plus b here, a plus b here, and done. So now let's say we have 2 bots, Dorji and Karma. So we have this function here, right? When I call this function, it actually returns this function. So this contains a function, this variable contains a function. So now I can do something like and call that function, right? I can also do this one and call function, so I can call it twice actually. Let's run it once. So it should log it, right? It's saying a is 2, b is 5, total is 7. So this one ran twice and this one ran once. But what we can do here is we can say a plus plus here. So every time this function runs, we are increasing the value of a. So let's see what happens now. So it's saying a is 2, saying a is 3, and now again it's saying a is 2. So for this one a is 2, but for this one a is 2 and for this one a is 3. So how did this happen? So when I called this function, it ran and it returned a function. But what happened is, with this function, it returned something called a closure. So it remembers what the value of a is, and it keeps it that way, because when I called it once, called this one once, it created a new instance of this function. But with this instance, it also created something called a closure for variable a, and it also remembers that value. So when I call it this one, it returned these instances, and now when I call it second time, it knows that a was 2 before, and a is added to it. We did a is equal to a plus 1 here, so now a became 3. And for karma, we returned another new instance, right? Another new instance that has another instance of a. So that's how it's still 2 here. So if we try to call karma again here, actually we are calling karma 3 times, so now it's becoming 2, 3 and 4. So you see, it doesn't matter when the function was returned, but when it returns from a function, it also takes the scope with it. So that is what a closure is. And I think it will be more clear if we put a breakpoint here and just run it, and you'll be able to see your closure here. So it's saying a is 2, b is 5. Let's play it again and see. It's remembering the value of a. When it returns the function, it also takes the variable with it. So that's a closure. When you try to call a function by passing it to another function, it is a callback. So let's see. Let's say I have a function called run this, and I have a call back here. I can call this one because this is a function. And let's say I have another function called also run this. We can say console.log this, and now we can call the run this function and pass this one here. So I'm passing a function to a function and trying to run it. So let's see what happens. So yeah, it runs and it locked this one, right? So I ran a function by passing it to another function. This is a callback. But what we can also do is, let's say we have another function called also run this. Let's log it here. Now let's change some things. So we can put a callback here, and we can take this one here. Now you see I'm passing this function to this function, and I'm passing the callback again to another function. So I'm passing the callback to 2 functions. So we can pass it to many functions as we like, but sometimes it creates a problem for us, and this is called a callback hell. When we pass it around too much, it becomes very difficult to understand how the function is actually running. So this is what we call a callback hell. We have our set timeout function here. So in this case, we are trying to run a function by passing it to another function. So this is a callback. Let's put in another function which is available on the window object, which is called set interval, and we can console log here. We can see interval, and we can give the timer as 1 second. And now if I try to run it, what happens? So you see this, what set interval does is it tries to run this function again every 1 second. So after 1 second it will try to run this function. So each second it will try to run this function. So that's the difference. Set timeout will delay the function, but set interval will run the function again and again after this time. So now let's move on to an example where we use set interval and build a hello world app. Let's say we have a h1 tag here with the text hello world. Let's give this tag an ID with name. Let's use a selector here and say text align center, and we can say font family area. Okay, this should be enough. So now what we will try to do is we will try to change the color of this hello world text every 500 milliseconds. So what we need for that is we need set interval. So we need a function here. We should run every 500 milliseconds. So what should this function do? So it should change the color, right? But let's say we have 3 colors, so we'll get 3 random numbers. So we use the math API for this one, math floor, which is a function, and math.random, which is also a function, into 3. So this will give us 0, 1 or 2. So we have our random numbers. If our random number is 0, we can say, actually we need a function for this one, so let's create a function here. So we can say color changer, and this can be something like document.get element by ID, and we can say name here, and we can do style dot color is equal to color. So we can pass color in here, and now we can run that function, color changer. So what do we want the color to be? We can say Dodger blue. Else if we have 3 indexes, so we can say if random is 1, what should we do? We can say color changer again, and we can say maybe tomato, and else, so if it is equal to 2, we can say it's orange. So let's see if this works. Yes, so it's working now. So it's changing the color of the hello world text every 500 milliseconds. So that's it. Now let's look into the final topic, which is promises. So what are promises? Promises are actually objects which can handle the final result of an asynchronous function, but it can be any function actually. So let's say we have a function called is good boy. Let's pass an argument to it. Let's say behavior, and we can return a new promise. So this is how we actually declare a promise, and inside it we can say resolve or reject. So based on the result, we can choose to resolve or reject the promise. So how do we do it? Let's say we have a condition here, if behavior is equals equal to good, then we can say then we can actually resolve it, right? Because it is the expected outcome. So we can say resolve give ice cream. If it is not the expected outcome, we can reject it. So we can say no ice cream. Now what we should do is we can call this function, right? Because we returned this promise here, so we should call this function. And we also need to pass in the behavior here. Let's say the argument is good. And now we can do something like then. So after this promise runs, it will resolve or reject, right? So how do we catch it? We catch it using a then. Now we can say result, and we can use the window object. We can say window.alert, and we can use the result. So now let's run it. So it's logging because I put in the argument is good. It's saying it has resolved the promise, and it's saying give ice cream. But what if we do replace it with bad? It didn't show any alert because it is caught differently, right? This is caught as an error actually. So this can be anything actually. So I'm just putting it as error, and we can again say window dot alert error. So when we run this one now, it should say no ice cream. So this is how we handle the result of a function. So this can be a function actually. So whatever this returns, we can resolve or reject based on the outcome. So this is how we use a promise. I have built a game where you have to select the correct name of the country for the given flag, and this project covers almost all the concepts we have covered so far. So please go through it. The link for this video is shared with this tutorial, and that's all. Keep coding and see you next time.